In this session, View from the Top, we're honoured to have three leading CEOs from some of New Zealand's most prominent companies telling us how COVID-19 affected their businesses, their strategies for managing the crisis, including doing business with China. Each CEO will share their insights. There will be plenty of time at the end of the three addresses for you to put questions to them from Slido or from the floor. Let me quickly introduce Greg Foran, Chief Executive of Air New Zealand, who also has a unique lens on China from his time there as head of Walmart. The airline's done a sterling job during this crisis, as we've heard from previous commentators, while at the same time undergoing quite a painful restructuring. Welcome, Greg.
Good morning. Kia ora koutou katoa. And I'd also like to acknowledge our distinguished guests, and unfortunately the Prime Minister and David Parker have just left, but Simon Bridges, thank you. And for all of you, thank you for coming along today. Zashang hao, wohin gasing jian da, ni jintian zemayang. And how? As Fran mentioned, I had the opportunity of living and working in China for 3 years. That was about 6 years ago. And it sort of brings me to what I think is a pretty important point about as we think about different countries that we deal with, in this particular case, China. And that is that, you know, your experiences when you are a tourist, or perhaps going there several times a year for business, are quite different from what occurs when you actually live in a country. And I've experienced that over my career, having now worked and lived in 5 different countries, about just what those differences are. And most recently in the United States, being able to live there and be part of the Walmart business and get around, in my particular case, probably a couple of thousand different locations in the United States, and actually see what happens in a country. In the case of China, working in Walmart, we had about 400 stores there, and I probably got to about 150 different locations during my 3 years there. And so when you tend to visit there, you end up in places like Shanghai and Beijing, if you're there irregularly doing business or you go as a tourist. You don't tend to go to places like Chongqing or Kunming or Jilan or Xuzhou. And you begin to understand some different aspects about the country, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But maybe first of all, a little bit about Air New Zealand. And unlike David Parker, who had 3 of his bosses here, I at times feel like the entire room is full of people who have a responsibility to Air New Zealand, and I thank you for that. It keeps us on our toes. What a start. So on the 2nd of February, Cam, we made a decision that we would stop flying to Shanghai. And that was a Sunday, and I was sitting at home and thinking, well, I'm starting my first day at Air New Zealand on Monday, the 3rd of February. So thank you, Air New Zealanders. It's been an incredible start, you know, basically what we found is that since the 3rd of February, we've seen a business whose revenue was circa 6 billion actually lose 99% of its revenue. And even for myself, who've done a few different jobs over the years, I can honestly say to you, I have never experienced that in my life. I've been in businesses when revenue or sales have gone down by 15% or maybe 25%. I've dealt with my share of natural disasters, from hurricanes and floods and fires, and unfortunately in the US, shootings in stores. But I've never actually been part of an organisation where effectively your total revenue disappears in a matter of weeks. And one of the things that happens when you do that is you start to reflect on the various stakeholders that you have in your business. And I've maintained for many years that there are 5 stakeholders that you have a responsibility to, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing Antonio's job or Miles' job. I would say that those 5 are, you've got to look after your customers, you've got to look after your staff, you've got to look after your suppliers. You'd better stay close to the community in which you operate. And of course, you've got your shareholder in your business. The interesting thing about this particular crisis has been that it's the first time in my career I have successfully disenfranchised all 5 stakeholders simultaneously. It's quite a hard thing to do. And it's not something that we as a brand and our reputation is so important that we feel comfortable with. But the reality is, when you think about it, and many of you are clearly customers of ours, you'd be saying, well, we'd like you to get back and flying a bit more. So can you do that? And by the way, you're holding a bit of our cash in those non-refundable tickets. So can you do something about that? And of course, if you're a staff member, you've been through a very traumatic 6 months. Over 4,000 of our Air New Zealanders have departed our business. Over a third of our workforce during lockdown. And not only that, but when I'm out flying, and I do it every single week, I was in New Plymouth on Saturday, I was in Gisborne on Friday, I will talk to our flight attendants, I'll meet with our team at the airports, and our staff are doing a terrific job at the moment. They're almost like essential workers. I was talking to a pilot just the other day who can't get the builders to work on his house because they know he's flying for Air New Zealand. And so they've said, well, we're not going to deal with you. We're frightened about where you've been. Or I talked to our flight crew who are doing cargo and passenger flights at the moment that I'll talk about in a minute. And if they go into a store and they're still wearing their Air New Zealand uniform, then they can get some feedback about whether or not they should actually be in the store. So I just want to share with you, it's tough for our staff as it is for our customers. And we've all got a part to play in that. Suppliers, obviously, bear the brunt of a crisis like this. It's a big deal if you were supplying Air New Zealand, and I was in Gisborne meeting with the Ngāti Porou on Friday, and they supply a number of fish products that we use in our catering. And of course, we're not flying really internationally to any extent, and so therefore we've impacted their business. And whether you're in the airline business and you might be running airports and we're asking you for discounts, you can understand that's a stakeholder that we've got some pressure on. Of course, communities are increasingly important, aren't they, in today's world? So we often talk about globalisation, but really what I see is I see a sort of bifurcation. I see people thinking more globally and then actually behaving more locally. And didn't level 4 bring that home to us, where we all learnt a lot more about the communities in which we live? But our communities are saying to us, gee, Air New Zealand, can you get out there and can you do a few more flights? Because we want you to juice up this economy. And certainly we've seen some improved performance during the school holidays for those of you who've been out and taken some time off and maybe been to Queenstown, which it would appear many people have been. Thank you for that. We're benefiting from that. But we're still not operating at the capacity that we were pre-COVID, and that will take some time to get back. And when you consider that a lot of our business, a lot of our sales domestically are business travellers, we've all got a bit used to doing these Zoom meetings, so we're going to have to weather through that for a bit longer. And of course, finally, that fifth stakeholder, our shareholder, has clearly seen some challenges there. So it's been an incredible time for Air New Zealand, a most incredible time, and crisis, and the ambassador mentioned this, and the quote from John F. Kennedy that he made in 1959 in Indianapolis, Mandarin word for crisis, 2 syllables, danger and opportunity. It's not actually quite correct grammatically, but in the interests of theatre, let's play with it. There is clearly then opportunity that comes from a crisis like this. And part of what we want to do in Air New Zealand is make sure that we think about that as we restart the business. Anyway, on to China. So why China? Well, the numbers are compelling, aren't they? Second largest international market for us, just behind Australia. And when people come here from China, they spend well. It is the world's largest tourism market, just 150 million people. And sometimes these numbers, you just roll them off your tongue. I used to do this a bit at Walmart, and then you go, wow, it's actually a pretty big number, 150 million tourists. By the way, 450,000 of those come and visit New Zealand every single year. And something that I witnessed in my time there was this burgeoning middle class. And, you know, to give you a sense of that, and I just stress a point here, averages are sometimes a bit meaningless. You have to be careful. You need to pull that back and get down to the specifics and the detail. But middle class, just a mere 630 million people over the next couple of years will enter the middle class in China. So it's a good market for us. Some of the things I've learnt in my time in China, first of all, visiting there often for business, and I tend to go there once a year, but then living there and working there. First thing I'd say is don't underestimate the scale. China's a big country. You know, geographically in size, it's virtually exactly the same size as the United States. Some big populations, aren't there? The city that I lived in, Shenzhen's got 13 million people. Go an hour down the road to Guangzhou, there's about 15 million. But if you include some of the outer suburbs, it's probably closer to 23. In Shanghai, where we fly, 25 million people. So don't underestimate the scale. Trust is a massive deal. In my time in China, maybe the single most important word that I ever learnt was trust. Because it's what people are looking for. By the way, not just in China, but anywhere. And with that comes values around your business. And those are things that you don't want to compromise, because if you do, you stand the risk of compromising trust. Long term, boy, this was a lesson for me. 3,000 plus years China has been around. So you've got to think long term. You're sometimes much better to be slower at the beginning, to worry about going a bit quicker at the end. And boy, you need to commit. You can't go in there half-hearted. I've seen a lot of people over the years, including Walmart, have fits and starts at this. If you want to be part of China and you want China to be part of you, then you have to find your very best people, and you've got to stick at it for a long time, and you've got to commit. And one last one, operational efficiency. You know, we've been flying to China, I think since about 2006, moved to daily flights in 2013. There was even a comment before about a link between China, Southeast Asia, through New Zealand to South America. One of the things that will either make that work or won't make that work will be operational efficiency. Something like slot times for planes, when you can actually land and when you can get out of that place. You adjust your slot times. Instead of having 2 planes on the route, you can have 1. What's that worth to us? Well, probably about $180 to $200 million less capital. So all of a sudden, the economics change. So operational efficiency becomes critical. There's been some comment about cargo, and I just want to take a moment and thank everyone for their support on cargo. We probably would be struggling to fly any international routes at the moment without the support of cargo. And that support is from probably many of you in the room who are using our vessels to get fresh fruit and vegetables, red meat, seafood, various other products up to China. And then, of course, we've got products like PPE coming back in. But it's critical. We couldn't imagine a world, could we, without Lenovo or Alibaba or Anchor or Manuka Honey. So we want to keep the cargo business going. We were running 5 flights a week in March. We increased that during April and May, and that's basically being maintained. So there's a lot of business, a lot of commerce getting done at the moment. And not just through to Shanghai. So when it gets to Shanghai, we're moving it to 12 other ports around the country. So we want to be back flying to China as soon as we can. We are there now, but predominantly on the back of cargo. There's some passengers that are joining those flights. And I think thanks to everyone's handling of COVID, and it has really been exceptional. And when I talk to colleagues and friends around the globe, they say to me, you know, the first place I want to go when this thing gets resolved is New Zealand. I don't want to go to Italy or Greece. I'm not necessarily planning to, you know, head over into the UK, but you let me know when those borders are open. I'd love to get to New Zealand. In our particular case in China, it's about understanding the differences of the customer. One of our core markets is North America. But the North American customer is quite different to the Chinese customer, the product that they're looking for when they get on a plane. And so we need to think very carefully about how we do that and pull that together. So we need to understand them well. And we need to think about the environment that we're working in. Even though it's been 6 years since I've lived in China, I've gone back every single year to get reacquainted with what's happening. And I've seen the pace of change of this country at an enormous rate. The work that they do around artificial intelligence and machine learning, the Internet of Things, robotics. You know, in Walmart stores over there, there are no cash registers. Because there's facial recognition, you go in, you complete your shopping, and out you go again. We need to think about that in terms of how we relate and trade with our customers in China, and also with our very important joint venture partners. So look, in conclusion, I think we're dealing with a new abnormal. We're not expecting in Air New Zealand that things are going to just revert back to the way they were, even if or when a vaccine will be found. I do think that we'll definitely be up and trading in time. Clearly, Australia is one that we're very interested in, on top of the Cook Islands. But further afield, China, I can assure you, is pretty critical to our thinking. Trust in brands is certainly the vehicle that gets you there. That is the sustainable competitive advantage, I believe, for Air New Zealand. And importantly, we want to build something to last, something that we're very proud of, that will see the test of time. So thank you everyone for your support. Thank you for all your support of Air New Zealanders, all our staff, our pilots, our cabin crew, our airports. We're going to get through this. We're a resilient bunch. And thank you. Shishini.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Antonia Watson, who's held the reins as Chief Executive of New Zealand's largest bank pretty much for a year, even though not formally confirmed till the end of the year. Antonia has a unique insight into how New Zealand firms right across the board, including those with major exposures to China, have come through and are coming through the COVID-19 crisis. And that focus is also informed by ANZ's own experts in China. Welcome, Antonia.
had to come to this side of the lectern because the clicker I see is here. Tēnā koutou katoa, pangiomin ni min hao. I was going to say to acknowledge our distinguished guests by name, but they've all had to leave, so I'll acknowledge the not so distinguished guests that are left behind. It's great to see you all here and so many familiar faces in the room, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Fran O'Sullivan and the Auckland Chamber of Commerce for arranging the summit again. Particularly, Greg called it a new abnormal period, I call it an unusual business as usual period. And ANZ banks many of your businesses, and I know Stu McKinnon, Mark Hiddleston, Ben Kelleher and their teams enjoy close working relationships with you. New Zealand's relationship with China is one of our most important and far-reaching, and despite COVID-19, our relationship continues to thrive. When the severity of COVID was recognised, ANZ saw the initial impact on our export to China due to the extensions of the Chinese New Year period, and then the logistical challenges of getting products through Chinese ports into their intended destinations. New Zealand's strong trade relationships with China helped to reduce the disruption to Kiwi goods entering the country, but some problems were inevitable. And this was more of a challenge for perishable goods, the fresh meat, the seafood, the fruit, which obviously have more limited shelf lives. The timing of COVID and subsequent travel restrictions couldn't have come at a worse time for China, as it coincided with that Lunar New Year holiday. And as we know, this tends to be a major period of food consumption where families gather and travel a long way together and eat together. And supplying that seasonal market is a major focus for many New Zealand food exporters, especially seafood, cherries and wine. The physical distancing, the travel restrictions and the economic concerns resulted in much lower consumption of high-end products during this time, and that impacted many of our business customers. And then we saw the holiday period extended, resulting in a delay in the resumption of buying activity and a slowing of logistics. Once work was allowed to resume, many factories found their normal workforce was stranded in other parts of China due to the travel restrictions, and like many other countries, delays in getting hold of mandatory PPE resulted in further delays to workplaces reopening. And at this point, New Zealand exporters became more focused on how the disease and shutdown would impact China's economy and the future demand for our goods. And meanwhile, New Zealand importers were also impacted. Supply of goods from other countries was compromised due to the high reliance on inputs produced in China, and that then compromised the ability of many global companies to manufacture goods. Across New Zealand, hundreds of thousands of business owners were in that same predicament, which forced many to look at their immediate cash flow and what they could do to reduce costs, and how they could find other revenue sources to keep their businesses afloat. Hand sanitizer seemed to be a popular choice for alcohol manufacturers. At ANZ, we were in the privileged position, really, to not only be considered an essential service during the lockdown, but also to arrive at it in a pretty solid financial position. Banks save up in the good times for the bad times, really. And it allowed us to move quickly to support our customers. We had a three-pronged strategy, and that aimed to free up as much cash as possible for our businesses and export customers. First off the back of the RBNZ moves, we dropped interest rates and reduced a number of fees, and that helped reduce customers' costs straight away. Secondly, we looked at how business customers and consumers, but the focus here being business, how we could help them preserve cash flow. Thousands of customers had their loan payments rescheduled, and in that first 4-week period, we had more than $11 billion of lending that we made adjustments to. And the third part of our strategy was access to capital and additional funding, and more customers did see this as a last option because many didn't want to take up new debt in uncertain times. However, by the end of May, we'd done more than $2 billion of new business lending. During this time, we also saw businesses take advantage of the government's wage subsidy, and these advance payments, I don't think we can underestimate the impact we saw that have on our customers' accounts. It really helped boost cash balances, help with immediate liquidity, and keep staff employed. We also saw, through our data, the flexibility of landlords accepting less rent from tenants in uncertain times, and especially when they weren't able to access their properties. Our transactional data showed that median rental payments on commercial property were down 31% on May this year compared to May last year. And as we can expect, our economic data also shows that global trade has eased this year. Although many countries have experienced high levels of cancelled sailings, there's been minimal disruption to ocean freight servicing New Zealand, mainly because of the demand for our exports. Conversely, as we've heard, air freight has become expensive due to the drastic reduction in the number of passenger flights, and that's limited some exporters' ability to quickly move product to market. Trade of goods from New Zealand to China has generally remained strong, but it varies considerably between industries. So I'll touch on some of the key industries that our customers operate in and what we've been seeing. Seafood. Initially, there were major disruptions to New Zealand's seafood industry, and we heard about them a lot in the media. Demand plummeted for high-end products such as crayfish, and they were specifically targeted at that Chinese New Year period. And I must confess myself to taking advantage of a cheap crayfish offer early in lockdown, and that kept us going for a couple of weeks. But this market we've seen now start to recover, although was not able to make up for that lost ground during the beginning of the pandemic. And while China is not an especially large market for New Zealand seafood, demand for our fish exports is continuing to grow. On the fruit side, cherries are specifically some grown for that Chinese New Year market again, and that was severely impacted, as we've talked about. The demand for other fruit, though, especially those high in vitamin C that have a long storage life and protective skin, remains strong. By the time of harvest for our major export fruits, kiwi fruit and apples, access in China was virtually back to normal. Demand for kiwi fruit in particular has benefited from the consumer perception that it's a healthy product. Zespri is the world's largest marketer of kiwi fruit. They quickly adapted their marketing campaigns to focus on those vitamin C benefits, and at this point in the season, they have a greater volume and greater percentage of the total crop shipped than any prior year, up 20% from 2019. Forestry, on the other hand, was severely disrupted as China is by far the largest buyer of New Zealand logs. Prices plummeted in February as demand for logs fell away due to the delays in resumption of consumption. In March, there were large stocks of logs on Chinese wharves, but then the supply of logs from New Zealand was cut as we entered our level 4 restrictions. Supply of logs from other regions such as Eastern Europe and Russia were also restricted at this time, and what that allowed was in-market stocks to be worked through. And that's meant that now we saw a sharp lift in prices, and that coincided with the resumption of log supply from New Zealand in May. They've eased slightly since, but still remain above normal levels. The Prime Minister talked a little bit about meat, but China is our largest market for New Zealand beef and lamb exports, having recently overtaken the US as our largest market for beef. Earlier in the year, when it was difficult to get meat to China, a lot of beef was diverted to the US, but as COVID hit America and China recovered, more of that was able to be diverted back to China. And although meat processing has slowed in many of the largest producing companies, the Brazils, Argentinas and the US due to COVID, we've also seen end-user demand weaker. So exporters are now starting to see prices ease back as supply has caught up with demand. Hopefully Miles will tell us a lot more about dairy, but our perspective of it, we saw some initial shipping challenges, but demand for dairy products still to remain strong. China buys about 33% of our dairy exports, by far our largest export market, but our exporters tended to be able to get product to market without significant disruption, and part of that was due to the strong relationship between Fonterra and Maersk through the Kotahi partnership. There's also been a particularly strong demand for pharmaceutical dairy products, such as lactoferrin, which has antiviral properties. Demand for infant formula and infant formula ingredients remains very strong, while the volume of milk powder shipped from New Zealand to China remains on par with last season. During the initial stages of the pandemic, China's own dairy industry converted a considerable volume of milk into powders, having diverted this away from liquid milk given the reduced consumption and the restrictions, which may impact future import demand and prices from China as this inventory is utilised. And I'm sure Miles might have some perspective on that to share with us. And finally, tourism and education, both sectors that have clearly struggled during the pandemic. And although domestic tourism is actually as large as foreign tourism in New Zealand, Kiwis travelling around doesn't earn foreign exchange, and we must be tight because the yields per customer are much lower. We do remain confident, though, that if a viable quarantine solution is found to allow foreign students back into New Zealand, demand from China and other countries is expected to be strong due to our COVID-free community transmission status. And I know our universities, polytechs and private training organisations are ready to go and are adapting, as we heard earlier. Before I finish, I want to make one more remark about the New Zealand-China relationship. No one can have a conversation these days about China without talking about the US, and ANZ's economies believe that economic fallout of COVID-19 has accelerated the relative decline of the US as the world's economic engine. It's also increasing the centrality of Asia, and particularly China, to the global economic cycle. According to our ANZ research forecasts, the Chinese economy will grow rapidly in proportion to the US economy, from 67% of US GDP at the end of last year to 75% at the end of next year. This rapid relative increase, which you can see from the chart, will result from the expected sharp contraction in the US this year, while Chinese output remains broadly stable, followed by a surge in Chinese growth and a less pronounced US rebound in 2021. The combined effects of the US-China trade war, the global downturn triggered by COVID, and the rapid growth of China's neighbours have reduced the importance of the US consumer market for Asian economies. In the first quarter of 2020, ASEAN countries surpassed the US as China's largest customers for the first time, purchasing 16% of Chinese merchandise exports compared to 14% that went to the US market. This trend is likely to continue in the wake of the pandemic as trade and supply chains become more regionally concentrated and as ASEAN recovers more quickly than the US. Although China's importance to the global economic cycle will continue to increase, the US dollar and US monetary institutions will still remain central to the global financial cycle. The driver of global recovery, if you remember from 2008 and the GFC, were US dollar liquidity supplied by the US Federal Reserve and Chinese growth. And actually, the same may well prove true for this crisis, particularly as China has emerged first from the pandemic and is likely to help lead a global demand recovery. Meanwhile, the extraordinary volume of liquidity made available by the Fed has helped ease global financial conditions, allowing some emerging market countries to loosen monetary policy significantly and some to even implement quantitative easing. And in the Asia-Pacific region, Indonesia and India are notable examples. The monetary authorities in these emerging markets have joined those in Japan, Australia and New Zealand in making sizable asset purchases, which is an important structural improvement in Asia's available policy toolkit. The pandemic is accelerating regional geopolitical and economic trends already well underway in Asia-Pacific. Geopolitical competition between the US and China will increase the complexity of the business environment in the countries trying to balance their relationships between the two powers. I don't want to walk or talk that tightrope. I think the Prime Minister and the Ambassador did it very well, and I'll leave that discussion to them. But our economists believe the relative importance of the US to the global economy will decline further as Chinese output will be more resilient and bounce back faster in the wake of COVID. So in conclusion, the impact of COVID on New Zealand's export sectors will largely be determined by the economic recovery of our global trading partners. We are very thankful that China's economy is expected to outperform most other parts of the world and is expected to be one of the few economies to actually expand in 2020. And ANZ anticipates China's growth this year will be about 1.8%, And if they remain successful in controlling COVID-19, it will continue to be an export-dependent country. That's great, but we can't take the New Zealand-China relationship for granted. And I've got 5 things here that I think we need to focus on and would love to hear other people's views on them. The first is to continue our strong government-to-government relationship. Simplifying cross-border access remains important. New Zealand businesses and banks need to continue to have strong on-the-ground connections in China, and that became more apparent than ever during COVID. Brand New Zealand is also stronger than ever post-COVID, and we should take advantage of that. And I was told recently that New Zealand produces enough food each year and there seems to be various numbers, but the one I like is feed 100 million people, because that sounds huge. But actually it's quite tiny by global standards. So the strategy for New Zealand Inc. still has to be about adding value to as much of that food as possible to extract as many dollars as possible. So I've talked enough. I look forward to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonia. And can I invite all the bankers in the audience to weigh in? And I'm looking at you, Don Brash, also former Reserve Bank Governor. I do see you frequently on broadcasts elsewhere. And, obviously David Wong-Lei and others, because I think it's quite important to expand on some of these issues which have been raised by Antonia about what the economic track might be going forward. But however, before we get to that point, Miles Hurrell, my great pleasure to introduce you. Miles is, as you know, Chief Executive of Fonterra. Miles told me a while ago he had a unique and early insight into the emergence of COVID-19 from the boots on the ground that Fonterra has in China. He said then that the business almost stopped overnight, but however, it's the dairy cooperative has had a very agile story to tell, and it's over to you, Miles.
Great. Thank you, Fran. Ni hao, kia ora. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. Michael, thank you very much for the invitation. Simon, great to see you here today. I'm going to take you through our special China is to Fonterra, the lessons we've learned through COVID-19, and touch on the next evolution of our relationship. It hasn't always been plain sailing for our business in China, but no market is without risk, but we've never been in better shape than we are today. China is an exciting place to do business. About a quarter of our farmers' milk goes to China. It's one of our most important markets and is very special to us, not only because of its size, but because of its potential. Dairy continues to grow, and while it's becoming an increasingly competitive market, the growth in dairy consumption continues to outpace the growth of local production, and more dairy imports come from New Zealand than any other country. Incredibly, 11% of all dairy consumed in China starts out on the humble green pastures of a Fonterra farm. Our success in China is thanks to the effort and commitment we get from our people, both here in New Zealand and in China, from every farmer through to every employee. Another key reason is our New Zealandness, our provenance, which is finding great favour with Chinese consumers. Take our out-of-home consumption, which we call our food service business. Last year alone, our China food service business earned $1 billion in revenue. Our mozzarella tops half the pizzas sold in China, and more than 90% of the leading bakery chains throughout China choose New Zealand butter. Our UHT cream was poured into 500 million cups of tea macchiato last year. These are numbers that every New Zealander can be proud of. It's the natural goodness of New Zealand milk that has helped us make an impact in China. Tea houses, cafes, restaurants across China are choosing New Zealand dairy, not because it tastes great, or it functions well in the kitchen, but it's safe, and it also comes from a pair of beautiful islands nestled in the South Pacific, where the people are friendly, animals roam freely, and we respect the importance of our environment and our natural resources. The lessons I'm sharing is never to underestimate the power of New Zealandness. It is special. It's easy for us to take safe, healthy, nutritious food for granted, but it's not something that's readily available to everyone. That's why our strategy is to treasure New Zealand milk. We've got a great business in China, and it's a market with a lot of potential. I want to touch on that, how our team has responded to the COVID-19 situation. Just as it has had everywhere, COVID-19 disrupted daily life in China very quickly. Having people on the ground was what was of course concerning for us as the initial reports of COVID impact started to emerge. But it was a huge benefit for us to be able to get an early insight to see what was happening. And it was amazing how quickly things did happen, the most dramatic of which was Wuhan being locked down just 2 days before the Spring Festival in January. Our food service was hit hard, as Fran alluded. We felt this hit throughout February when most restaurants were closed. But the sector has started to recover and is almost back to 100% of where it was pre-COVID. In those first few months of COVID-19 in China, there was very little impact on ingredients business, which was fortunate. We had already contracted a large percentage of our milk into China, and it's helped us emerge from Corona unimpacted in our ingredients business. And while we're a smaller player in the China consumer market, we saw an initial spike due to panic buying, as we saw here in New Zealand, but this has since levelled out. On the whole, China is turning a corner. Things are picking up, but I wouldn't say they're back to normal. Stores and restaurants are opening. Our ingredients customers' facilities are back up and running, but again, not to full capacity in some cases. A key learning for us is the need to be flexible and adaptable and be prepared to try new ways of doing things. Some things will work, some won't, and we need to be okay with this. We've seen this mentality play out in our own business and that of our customers. Those that have been able to adapt quickly have also been able to respond quickly. Our team of about 1,500 people on the ground in China has a huge amount of capability, and this has been apparent when we've had to look at how responding to COVID-19. For example, our teams in China weren't able to visit customers during lockdown, so they quickly set up virtual training sessions and live streams where our anchor food professional chefs demonstrated how to cook recipes using our butter and cheese. Over 1 million viewers tuned in. Many of these are now new business leads. Normally these types of sessions take a long time to create, set up and execute, but our team on the ground turned them around in a matter of days, all the while working from home, juggling the stress and extra pressures we've all become acutely aware of ourselves. This is something we need to hold on to and nurture. Some of the trends and changes we've seen will stick around and others will be short-lived. For us, this situation has shown that our business is more resilient than we perhaps realised. Our global supply chain and diverse product mix and customer base has helped us minimise disruptions for our customers and our business. We have sales teams all over China who are adaptable and work with customers to stay relevant to them. Our food service business is now in over 300 cities. This enabled us to come back from COVID a lot faster and appreciated. We're making good progress, but there is still more recovery needed. We're able to take these lessons we learned in China and adapt those for other markets. Fonterra is deeply committed to China. We don't just want to be known as an importer of dairy products. Fonterra cares about the communities in which we work in and alongside, and we attach tremendous importance to establishing strong links with local businesses and communities in China. Over the past 40 years, we've worked with the Chinese government, local governments and companies as a trusted partner in the development of the Chinese dairy industry. These collaborations have provided us many learning opportunities. At the same time, we also hope we've contributed some of our own strengths to those exchanges and the long-term development of China and New Zealand in the field of agriculture, animal husbandry, environmental protection and food safety and quality. For example, take our China farms. We established 2 farming hubs just outside of China where we produce local milk for the Chinese market. In building those farms, we've demonstrated that our role in China is just more than an importer of food. We've helped develop the local Chinese dairy market, lending our expertise in farming techniques and animal husbandry. In March this year, we announced our intention to sell those farms. This decision was driven by a strategy, which means we've decided to focus less on offshore milk pools. Even though we may not own these farms in the future, they've helped us develop the local industry, which was one of our original aims. But we have much more to do in China. Our commitment to this market is enduring. Creating new innovative products and applications is key to helping Chinese consumers helping our Chinese customers reach new Chinese consumers needed to keep pace with this fast-moving market. To better understand these trends in a post-COVID environment, we're investing in new ways to connect more closely with our customers throughout China. As part of our commitment to China, we're investing in a new R&D site in Shanghai and building a new application centre in Wuhan next year. Shanghai is a strategic centre for Fonterra. It's where our head office is based in that region, and it's the heart of our business. And while Wuhan has become known as the epicentre for COVID-19, it is much more than that for us. It is the largest city in central China. Wuhan is a regional hub for commerce, politics, industry and education. The area has grown from a collection of small commercial ports to a metropolitan area 20 times the size of that of Auckland. It is key to our expanding our business in central China. Building a new application centre will help us better serve customers in China's inner provinces and grow our food service business. We want to send a signal that we're serious about our presence in China, and cooperating on product development and innovation at Wuhan is another way of moving this relationship forward. While COVID has kept me from visiting China recently, I certainly hope to visit again soon. Wherever I'm there, I take the time to do a market visit. Nothing makes me prouder than seeing New Zealand products on the shelves of Chinese supermarkets. It's the same feeling you get when you watch an All Blacks beat Australia. Inherent and humble pride in that Kiwis can achieve anything when you work together. Not only are New Zealand food products safe and delicious, but you can appreciate the grit, hard work and ingenuity that's gone into them thousands of miles back home. We've been in China for 40 years. We have some amazing relationships, consumer insights and a great team on the ground. Every day we have the privilege of working with e-commerce partners like Alibaba, with global startups, tech firms, food companies, from tiny street stalls to global giants. We've learned a lot along the way in China, some good and some tough lessons too. Any New Zealand business looking to step into the market and grow their presence in China should feel free to talk to us. We've certainly learned a lot and we're happy to share any time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These three speakers have generously put aside some time for your questions, so I hope you actually do engage. That's what you're here for as well today. And I'd like to actually invite somebody from the audience to kick off just with their own reflections on what they've heard as to whether it makes you more positive about the New Zealand spirit and resilience, and certainly from my perspective, that's what was coming through very strongly to me. But from the audience, please. Thank you, Don. Don Brash, down the front. Don's, as you know, former Reserve Bank Governor and also Chair of ICBC in New Zealand. If you could bring the microphone to Don just down here, thank you.
Thank you. Just an observation rather than a question. You quoted, I think, Antonia, the relative size of the US and Chinese economies. I think we're using market exchange rates. Many economists using PPP, purchasing power parity exchange rates, suggest that the US economy and China are already on rough parity in terms of size. I saw a factum the other day that written by an American author, between 2011 and 2013, China used as much cement as the US used in the entire 20th century. And I think it reminds us just what an extraordinary size that country is, an extraordinary market for New Zealand.
Any other reflections before I go to the questions which have come through on Slido? Okay, the first two are, one down here. Stephanie Honey from the International Business Forum.
Thank you very much, Fran. I found all of those presentations very interesting, but Miles, if I may direct my question primarily to you, I think. You made a very compelling case for the need for a sort of an on-the-ground presence in China. I mean, that's clearly been the sort of secret sauce for Fonterra in that important market. What are the implications, do you think, of the restrictions on person-to-person connections that we're facing now with the pandemic? I know that there's a lot of thought going in at the sort of MFAT and NZTE end about what their staff can do for businesses in the market. Is that the answer? How important do you think the lack of direct contact is going to be for New Zealand businesses in that market? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, and it was mentioned earlier by Greg, I mean, that the importance of the relationship and trust is vital in the Chinese market, as it is in a lot of markets, of course. And not having that face-to-face presence is difficult. I think that the responsibility or the role of NZTE through this period is going to be critical. I think that they have already announced their intention to lift their presence or their role over the next period. So I think it's important we stay close to them and they can help. And then there are also those companies such as us and Air New Zealand that have feet on the ground and without getting into a competitive environment, we're more than happy to help out with insights and understanding what those markets look like. So use those companies that are also there. Think about New Zealand as a whole.
Just projecting forward on the questions of customers, one for Greg Foran from Jerry Clode. Chinese customers are different to US customers. Can you explain more? Thank you.
Okay. I guess the first comment I'd make here is that averages, again, don't do you a lot of help here. And my experience of both countries has been there are enormous differences in customers in both countries, as there are in New Zealand, by the way. So, what I see happening in Gisborne on Friday is not necessarily the same as what I see happening in Auckland at the moment. So, the comment I'd make generalised is that, and it's building on the point that you just made, Miles, trust is an important component when you do business in China. Trust of product, trust of the company, knowing that what you're buying is actually the real thing and it hasn't been adulterated in any way, knowing that the company you're dealing with is going to stand by its product and do what it needs to do. There was a comment previously, and I've forgotten who, it may have come from the floor, around food safety, being able to track products. I could regale you with many stories that I personally experienced where things like fox meat had been substituted for donkey meat and those sort of things, and your ability to deal with that on the ground and maintain your brand's reputation is incredibly important. So probably the single biggest point I would make is that, for example, in the US, people generally are more trustworthy of what they're seeing. In China, generally less trustworthy.
That's important perspective for this audience, and I think reflecting on previous years when we have had biosecurity challenges, but also, Miles, how well I think New Zealand has overcome them. Just on that point, could you share a little bit about that path towards building that trusted brand, and particularly also as you move further up to value?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit unfortunate, but you do learn from your mistakes. And we had a bit of an own goal back in 2013, and that really helped reshape our business from a food safety quality perspective. The traceability we have on our products now, we thought we needed to get to a point of world leading, but world leading never comes because, of course, the world catches up very quickly. But what we've found through that is that it became almost a ticket to the game. Now it's actually what our customers are demanding from us to go further, and how we're working with our customers globally around traceability, where our product comes from, and then expanding that further to say what is the story that goes behind your food. And so in our situation, understanding the farms in which the product's made, the stories that the animal welfare situation that goes on with our farms, and all those things there really help to just sell your products.
A question from the floor through Slido for Antonia. As banks have currently reduced appetite and funding, what else could banks do to help support NZ businesses navigate through COVID-19? This is on the back of capital restriction, increased risk profile of businesses, and an uncertain economic environment.
Thanks, good question.
Yeah.
I think just an initial comment on funding is that we're in a very different position as a banking sector than we were in, say, 2009, where funding was a significant issue for us. We couldn't refinance the short-term borrowing that we'd done. So liquidity was a problem. All those things, capital, liquidity, funding, we have as a sector come into this crisis and very, very well. We are, I wouldn't want to sort of say awash with cash, but the quantitative easing ends up on banks' balance sheets, so funding is not an issue. And in fact, we've done ANZ specifically has done over $7 billion of new lending since that sort of end of March, early April period. Now the question's dropped off the screen, so I'll miss the rest of it. But again, we've got a fine balance. So we are open for business, and I think the numbers support that. We're open for business where our customers want to and are willing to borrow, and that's certainly something we've seen in the business sector, is that there's still enough uncertainty that, yes, we've got working capital facilities, and in fact, the liquidity floating around with wage subsidies, etc., has meant that we've only got, on average, 30% of customers' limits being used in their working capital facilities, and that compares to 40% normally at this time. So more working capital, or less working capital needed at the moment than usual, and there are various reasons for that are some of which are obvious. When it comes to new term lending, we've absolutely seen, for COVID-impacted businesses, we've absolutely seen a wish to wait till there is more certainty, and Level 1's given that. But the thing that we're saying is that, you know, our lending policies are more flexible at the moment, in that we will look through the current period of time, because we understand that times are not normal, but we need to be able to look through that and see what a plan might look like going into the future. And some businesses aren't ready to have that plan. But no, I think the message I want to leave you with is we are open for business. Be talking to your bankers. It's in no one's interest that we have people losing their homes or their businesses, albeit that is absolutely inevitable in some cases, and that's a shame. And the earlier that you get in touch with us, and if you find yourself in that position, the better.
Greg, a question for you up the top of the frame there. COVID-19 would have affected you regardless if you were leading Walmart or Air New Zealand. Do you look at Walmart and see how it's been handled in the US and see strengths in New Zealand's handling of the pandemic?
Yes. I guess there's three things that come to mind, Fran, when I think about how I see COVID playing out around the world. The first one is geography has a part to play in here. And obviously, if you're an island and you're surrounded by water, it's a little bit easier than if your borders happen to be a bunch of other countries. So a little bit harder in the US when you've got borders, obviously, down to Mexico and then borders up to Canada. And despite what some people may think, there aren't actually walls that go all the way between Mexico and the US. There are portions, but generally only a couple of miles worth. The rest of it will tend to be either a river or you can effectively just pretty easily walk over. Second thing is that government has a bit to play in it in terms of how governments operate around the world, and we're seeing even a bit of that in Australia in terms of different levels of government. And then the third but most important one is culture. And I guess as I reflect on the way that New Zealanders have approached lockdown, and I do my own little survey as I get around the place, about 90% of the people who I have spoken to over the last few weeks actually have reflected back and said they quite enjoyed the lockdown. They've recalibrated what they've done in their lives. It depends a little bit on their age. If they're a bit younger, millennials, they were quite keen to get back to work. If they lived on their own, they have a different view. But if you were the sort of 35 plus somethings, you suddenly, reunited with nature. You developed your 5 senses. You found out that it wasn't all that much fun spending 10 hours of your week travelling backwards and forwards to work in terms of traffic. You've worked out that you can do 2 days a week at home. You didn't end up getting divorced from your spouse. You found that your children actually, you developed a new relationship. So, that's a cultural thing that happens. In the US, my experience has been telling someone in Kansas or Missouri or Mississippi or Louisiana or West Virginia to do something, and this is the way that they're going to do it, is fraught with a bit of danger. And, I can understand that it is quite difficult in the United States to do things like saying, we're locking down. And you even see the different behaviours, say, between what's happened up in the northeast. You think particularly around New York, where people first identified it. It's probably because they were doing more testing there. There would have been a little bit more international travel. But their reaction to it is quite different than, for example, what's happening in Arkansas, where they never locked down and cases are continuing to increase. So 3 aspects to it. One is geography has a part to play. The second one is government, obviously, to some extent. But the third one is a culture. And, people in this neck of the woods are more likely to follow instructions and do what's requested and actually enjoy it. And the same in many Asian countries, whereas in the United States, you're more inclined to say, actually, I'll decide.
Okay, question from Jimmy Wong to all panellists, and perhaps we can start with you, Miles, on this one. Can you share a little bit about how each of you dealt with the lockdown personally and professionally? Then I'll lead on after that to a question which has disappeared about mental health and resilience in these times.
Well, firstly, maybe I'm part of that 10% that with a 7-year-old at home, Greg, it was not easy to homeschool. Which is why I spent most of my time in the office overseeing the command centre. So we set up a command centre very early on, and we had circa a dozen odd people in the office that were running the show. So I sort of stayed out of their hair as best I could. But on a serious note, I did enjoy the time to spend with the family. To take the time out, being a global business, a lot of time was spent on the phone in the evenings and early morning, checking on our teams, and it's probably one of the things that we've just got to, we spend a lot of time now thinking about it, and here we are in a room with 400 or 500 people, and yet we've got people in markets, 2,000 people in Chile, 1,500 people in Brazil. These people are in a terrible state. And so it's very difficult to imagine the situation that they're going through in their own personal lives. So while China seems to be getting back to some normality, New Zealand is getting back to normality. We've still got half our work population overseas. So that still takes a lot of time and effort and energy, and for myself and the lead teams who work through that. But pleased to get the time with the family. And while that didn't help Air New Zealand, it's certainly I've enjoyed that.
I too am a little bit nostalgic for especially for level 4 lockdown. It's sort of everything became so much more simple. All the engagements fell out of the diary, and you didn't have to worry about the conflicting priorities. It was just work and what to eat for dinner, really. But again, to the China relationship, one of the things that we at ANZ were lucky about is we'd seen the pandemic play out in our offshore markets, and we could learn from that. So we were very ready for the very quick onset of level 4, which made it easier for that transition. And I'm still amazed at how well everyone adapted to. I sat in the room, in our spare bedroom in the corner for however long it was, 9 weeks, and it sort of seemed normal, and it was surprisingly easy. I wouldn't want to do it forever, but it's still, I think we've all learned how much you can do without needing to get on a plane every week, or even more often for some of us. Sorry. Sorry, Greg. choke from the Air New Zealand table. But, I think it was a good chance to reassess, and the teamwork and the camaraderie that came over Zoom drinks as opposed to around the water cooler, it was a surprisingly almost energising time. I wouldn't want it to, and the circumstances were terrible, but actually the ability to do something very, very different and do it successfully was incredible.
You touched on this leadership role before, Greg. Can you expand, what it meant also to you personally and professionally?
I found it more like a rehearsal for the end of the world, actually, Fran. When your revenue goes from sort of 6 billion to virtually nothing, then there's a real sort of awakening of what you need to do. And look, for me personally, we sort of had to dig in and just get on with it, and being an essential service, try and work out what we needed to do and how we needed to do it. We basically, Cam, spent the first probably 8 weeks winding everything down. And I can tell you it's a heck of a lot more fun growing than it is shrinking. And so that was sort of the first 8 weeks, and then we've probably have spent 8 weeks in limbo of sort of putting things into cupboards and putting sheets on them and locking them down. And then the best thing has been in the last 8 to 10 weeks to actually start to grow again. And the domestic network is up and running. And I don't say this with any real facts to support it, but probably relative to our scale, Air New Zealand is doing more flying than any other airline domestically in the world. Probably. And that's thanks to all the hard work that everyone put in to get us to the place where we're at. On both flights that I was on Friday and Saturday, I didn't see one customer wearing a mask, which is pretty incredible as well. So for me personally, took the opportunity to learn as much as I could about the business, and we're glad to be back on track and growing again.
You can see with the frequent travellers among this room just how crowded those planes are now getting to be.
We are, and every time, that Zoom call, which many of us did, fell over, I would have to say I did. Keep it going. Keep falling over.
You'll have to bring all your staff back into the office, Antonia. Hey, just on that point, though, about mental health and resilience, I mean, clearly you are all resilient leaders, but what about your staff? What did you have to put in place for there?
Yeah, so we have, I'd say, half a dozen times a week, a sort of central group sort of stood themselves up without any input from leadership, stood themselves up and said they're going to have sort of a mental wellbeing sort of Zoom calls. And they've been very well attended globally, and there's no set agenda. It's just sort of, having a discussion, what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your life, and they started out a little bit slow, and then people really got into the momentum and started to share what's going on in their personal lives. And I've been in Fonterra for 20 years, and you think you know some people pretty well, but it's not until you see them in their pyjamas or their dogs or their kids on their lap that you realise who they really are as a person. And so that for me was something that we've continued on, and we will continue to do that post COVID.
Yeah, I think I'd reiterate the lessons in it in connection, because you take things for granted when you can see or talk to people every day, but you actually don't see or talk to people every day, and you can't go out and visit every branch or every corporate office over the course of a year, but you can talk to them all on a big call, and we did that sort of communication a lot more, and I think staff almost felt more connected not seeing leaders than they ever did when leaders were visiting, but as I say, you can't see everyone at once. And a lot of emphasis on checking in on people, and people handled it very, very differently. It was a real lesson for the people who desperately wanted to be in the office to the people who are still nervous to be in the office, to be honest. So you've got this an understanding that huge range of staff. I mean, we had apps available for support. We had the usual corporate psychological support, all that sort of thing. But like I said before, there was also that underlying, we're all in something together here. We can all actually make a real difference for our customer base, and we're going to work on that. So people actually gave more of themselves than probably a lot of the time they usually would.
I guess two key things stick in my mind. The first one is the use of live streams, and it sounds like that would have been reasonably common in most businesses. But even today, if I go out and talk to our staff, they will say how important they found these live streams. And there would have been thousands of live streams literally done in Air New Zealand. Thousands, wouldn't there, Yvonne? Because everyone at this table down here was doing it with their own team. I was doing them. And there were times when we would have 2,500 to 3,000 of our staff on a live stream and then would open it up for questions. And so that was a big deal. The second thing is putting in place some mechanisms where people can actually reach out when they need a hand. And I can tell you, I think in the last month we've had 64 of our staff reach out and say, through an app that we developed quickly and put out there and say, we need a hand. We're past sort of being able to manage this on our own. We set up a trust as well and to helping people through that, the Athena Trust. But they were two of the key things that we did.
A question here from Simon. I'll just take one from Simon Draper, then I'll come up the back here. Simon Draper from Asia, New Zealand, just saying basically in the absence of travel, knowledge of Asia will be crucial. And Auckland is lucky, excuse me, because it has a large Asian diaspora here, which has been undervalued in the past. Simon's question is, what should New Zealand companies do to raise their Asia knowledge? And the myth that Asians are entrepreneurs when many New Zealand firms won't employ them. So what will you do? Are you going to do anything? Is there some way of utilising the diaspora in New Zealand during this period when we can't fly, can't visit? Is there connections there?
Well, I think we already do to a certain extent. We have a large Asian population that work for us now and use those connections to help our business grow throughout Southeast Asia. So I think it's already embedded. It's probably just not something that's explicitly talked about as much as what we should.
I think what should New Zealand companies do? Be curious and understand the importance of the relationships. I mean, one of the things that I've heard, and I've heard it today, and I've heard it, and I talked about a couple of them earlier, is that the companies that had deep relationships within China were able to thrive because they had someone to help them at the other end, just as we have bankers at the other end, and we say to our customers, the important thing is that you've got someone in blue at both ends of the transaction. But I think that it is be curious and take advantage of the Asian, and we have a large number of Asian staff as well. Take advantage of them and learn as much as you can.
I'm always keen on travelling, and I would be making sure, and by the way, it's joking aside, nothing beats actually getting on a plane and going to these places and putting aside time to go and learn what's happening. And it doesn't even have to be in your own industry. It can be in someone else's industry. I went and spent a day with KFC in China last year, and the lady who runs it's doing an exceptional job. And the way they have developed their digital expertise to be able to deal with customers at Kendoji KFC right across China is incredibly important. So to build on exactly what you said, Antonia, be curious, get up there, go and spend a couple of days and learn, and then invite those people back down here to help develop your own business.
We have a question up the back.
Morning, Fran. One of the key reasons New Zealand survived the GFC reasonably well was the timing of the FTA back in 2008. Well done, Helen Clark. Both the Prime Minister and Minister of Trade mentioned the upgrade to the FTA and interesting timing on that. So I'm interested in the panellists' reflections on the breadth of whether that FTA upgrade was everything you would have hoped for, and kind of how do you see that panning out, particularly with the e-commerce chapter, given how e-commerce has developed through COVID as well?
I'll start if you like. I mean, the simple answer is, was it everything we'd hoped for at the outset? No, because there was no additional support for dairy, so I'd have to say that. That said, where it's landed, we were comfortable. It's heading in the right direction for New Zealand as a whole. The safeguards for dairy come off in 2024, so when you're dealing with an industry that's 150 years old next year, an extra few years is not the end of the world from our perspective to see those safeguards removed. So at the outset, not a great discussion took place, but as we get into it, for New Zealand Inc. as a whole, very happy.
I'd agree. It's just a reiteration of the fact that it's an important relationship and that we're prepared to keep developing it. And we're a very small country that is very, very, very remote and highly reliant on exports. And any message that we're open for business is a good one.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the floor, if there is one. Michael Barnett, and then I'm going to wrap for morning tea.
I'm Terry Lee from New Zealand. So I have a question for Miles. Fonterra is the biggest dairy company in New Zealand and maybe one of the biggest in the world, and you play a very important role in New Zealand economy. And my question is about now we are facing the pandemic, and the pandemic is going to be a new norm, and we will have another very important thing happen in 2021 in dairy industry, which is going to be the dairy review. So what's your views on how Fonterra can play the roles of leadership in New Zealand dairy business in the global market, especially in China, facing the new normal and these challenges? Thank you.
Yeah, great. You've heard today the importance of trust, traceability, what consumers are looking for, and I think China is leading the way in that from a global standpoint. They're the ones that are wanting to know where their product comes from, can it be trusted, what is the story that goes behind it. And I think New Zealand as a whole and Fonterra is uniquely placed when you put it against your global peers around the world. So how do we amplify that? And we've come off the back of a generation of quite significant milk growth in New Zealand. And of course, we're going into a period now where we don't see any significant milk growth for the foreseeable future. So it's how do we use that limited resource and target the best customers, the best consumers, those customers that actually value what it is we produce here in New Zealand, and take that to the world. And as I say, I think China stands out as a key market for that. They want to know where their product comes from, and we have that product and the story that goes with it. So there was a question there about the dairy review. I don't see the dairy review as an impact on the business going forward. I think that'll be, the legislation will go through it in due course, and we just focus on the business at hand.
One final question from Michael Barnett up the front.
Thank you, Fran. Greg, question for you. I think I spoke about earlier on the tourism numbers, coming to New Zealand from China, and I think you mentioned the 450,000 people that are coming down here. And I feel like I'm getting mixed messages because the Prime Minister said we're going to have to do a reset on that sector. A reset to me sounds like less numbers, more value, less volume, which to me is not a good thing for you. So I look at that and say, is a reset, is that a long game? What are we going to do short term? And also, are you aware, or is the industry aware of, what are the conditions that we need to create that are going to allow us to open borders again so we can be prepared, not only for your sector, but for other sectors associated with travel, tourism, hospitality?
Two great questions, Michael, and I'm going to take the second one first because it's easier. And easier in terms that I can look at my good friend Chris Seat down here at the front and him and I have the odd chat about what are we thinking and feeling about borders and how they're going to open. And it's complex, isn't it? And like anything, until you get into the detail and understand exactly what has to happen, you can sometimes sit around the dinner table at night and have the discussion with the family and say, well, gee, why aren't we just opening in the Cook Islands and get on and do it? And the answer is yes, but you need to solve for this, and you need to think about that, and you need to consider this, and you need to consider that. Just consider, for example, what happens with transit. So Cam, we're flying quite a few planes with cargo. That's great, and we're able to get some passengers on those cargo flights. So let's say a plane comes in from the United States, comes in from LA or San Francisco, it's got 100 passengers on it. About a third of them are simply transiting through this country to try and get somewhere else. And being able to make sure that those transit customers aren't mixing with anyone else in the plane or in the airport or wherever is important, because otherwise you're then going to have to quarantine all of those people as well. So as we think about borders and we think about corridors and how all this works, I know that Chris and his team are doing a great job and have all of our support to think through all of these sensibly and carefully. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest not to get the country back up and running again, but you've got to deal with all the stakeholders and do this sensibly and carefully. Your first question around tourism is much more complex, because it's sort of a what you see depends on where you stand. And that's something that I know the team are actively working on with Tourism New Zealand and all the various industry boards to decide, what does tourism look like when it restarts? Does it just go back to exactly what we were doing before, or does there need to be a more nuanced and targeted approach? And they're thinking that through at the moment. More work to do in that space.
Thank you. I think one word sums up what we've heard this morning from three quite stellar CEOs, and I think that is resilience. Personal resilience, professional resilience, and importantly, resilience of the firms that they are leading. We have come through a hell of a time. I don't think anyone has experienced quite what Greg Foran has gone through, going down to effectively 1% of the business. That's mind-blowing, actually. It would crucify a bank if it happened to a bank, but we can be assured that ANZ is in reasonable shape, and that so is the New Zealand banking system. I think also looking at Miles and his team, also on the ground, just going out and doing that hugely entertaining way of just shifting food service and food product. You know, your chefs get out there and suddenly they've got 1 million customers and everyone's taking home pats of butter and, doing home cooking. I mean, this is sort of kind of not what we used to see when we used to go up in China and trek around with you and various prime ministers over the years. So I've actually been I really feel quite good about hearing this today, and I do thank you. I come away quite inspired and optimistic for our future. Thank you.